Hey guys, it's me again, Miss Rodney, with another Bible story for you as we finish this week toward Easter. I have in front of me several things that we're going to talk about today in our story. The first one is a cup with bread. The second one is a bowl with water and a cloth. Last week we were watching Jesus as he went into Jerusalem. As you remember, we have the beautiful entry into Jerusalem that Jesus had on the donkey that he had sent the disciples to find. All of the people were worshiping him as he came in. It was quite a sight. For the most part of that week, Jesus spent time teaching in the synagogue. Or in the temple. He would go in there and he would teach the ways that God wanted us to live our lives. He shared the truths, God's truths that were found in the scrolls, which is our Old Testament in the scriptures. And each night he would go back to a house outside of the Jerusalem where his friends lived, and he would be with his disciples, teaching them still. To the very end, Jesus taught. It's time for the Passover, which is the meal that everyone began to share in celebration of the time that the angel of death freed them through the Passover to go with Moses and to escape to Egypt. During this time of the Passover dinner, people would gather together in homes and they would eat a special meal. They still do that to this day. And we've talked about that in the past, the different foods that they eat. Jesus told his disciples to please go find a house. He told them some man to go talk to, and told them that he wanted to eat in the upper room of this particular house. So the disciples did as Jesus asked, and they went to this home. They secured the upper room, and they prepared a meal for Passover for all 12 of the disciples. Jesus gathered all of them there that day, that evening, and they were unsure of what all was getting ready to happen because Jesus had talked with them about some things that just seemed so strange to them, especially the fact that he was going to leave them. They just didn't understand that yet. To begin the evening, though, as they gathered up there, Jesus, and as the food was being prepared, Jesus removed his cloak and he gathered a basin, a bowl, and he took that bowl and the cloth that was with it, and he bent down to each one of the disciples and he began to wash their feet. Now, as you recall, back then they wore sandals, so their feet became very dusty and dirty everywhere that they went. So usually it was the job of a servant in the household to come and wash the feet. It wasn't a very wonderful, glamorous job to do because people's feet got pretty dirty and pretty nasty walking up and down those dusty, dirty roads. But Jesus decided to do that. God's Son decided to do that for each one of his disciples. And he bent over and he picked up the cloth and he began to clean each one of their feet. Peter objected to it because he said, you're not my servant. You don't need to do that. And Jesus said, I'm doing this for you. The purpose of Jesus doing that, as he told the disciples later, was that none of us, not one of us, is too great or too powerful or too wonderful not to serve another person. That it's very important that we know that we are to serve other people. So Jesus proceeded to wash their feet, teaching them every minute that he had left with them. The meal was prepared for them. They ate the meal, and during the meal, Jesus turned to the disciples and he's told them that one of them would betray him. Well, that caused a huge uproar around the group. I mean, like, is it me? Is it me? No, 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 Jesus, none of us are going to betray you. And he looked straight at Judas and he said, go and do what you need to do. And Judas got up and left. For you see, Judas had already made an agreement with the priest that he would betray where Jesus was, where he was the most by himself, so that they could arrest him. They didn't want all the people around him because they were afraid of what the people, how they would react, that they would riot when they tried to take Jesus away. So instead, Judas had been given 30 pieces of silver. He had sold Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver. So Judas gets up and he leaves the upper room and he goes to the priest to tell them where Jesus is heading next. As the evening finishes, as the supper ends up, Jesus then takes a moment with his disciples to share with them something that is very important, very special to him, and is to us this day. Jesus took a cup with wine in it, as was their custom back then. And he asked them each to share a sip of this drink, saying that this was his blood and that they were to remember this and to keep doing this in honor of him. Confusing again to them because they're thinking, you're not going anywhere. They still don't understand. But that's the first thing that he asked them to do, to drink. Then the next thing that he did, and he explained, let me go back to this, he explained that this blood was, and this wine represented his blood that was going to be shed for them. Again, very confusing to them. Where are we shedding blood, Jesus? But he knew, Jesus knew, because he was fully divine, as was he fully human, but he knew what his fate was. He knew what was getting ready to happen, completely and totally. He also took a piece of bread, and their bread was the flat bread that we've cooked sometimes in Sunday school, but he took the piece of bread and he broke it. And he said this represents his body that is broken for us. He again knew the kind of death that he was going to face was one that would cause him to be broken. And then he gave some of the bread to each one of the disciples. This again is something that we do in our communion services. And when we do it, I think that sometimes we do it kind of flippantly. We're just in there just to get the bread and dip it in the juice. But that's why I ask you to stop before we ever take communion in children's church. Stop and pray and thank Jesus for something that he's done for you that week. Because this means that Jesus died for you. And that's the importance of this every time that you take communion. That his blood was shed for you, that his body was broken for you. And after this is finished, Jesus then talks with the disciples about what is up ahead. Again, he's very clear with them about his death, his upcoming death, but it just doesn't seem to set in with them. He tells them to wait for him after this is all over in Galilee. They're still not sure. And then he tells Peter that he is going to deny Jesus 3 times. Well, Peter, being the brash soul that he is, he says, no, there's no way that I'm going to, deny you, Jesus, no way. Well, it does happen. And then Jesus looks at the group after he's given them these last bits of instruction, and he tells them that he's going to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus takes with him Peter, Andrew, and John, and he goes up into the garden, and he asks them to stay awake and to watch him. And Jesus goes to pray, and he prays to God. And remember again that Jesus was fully human and fully divine. The human part of his body knows the pain that he's getting ready to face. And he asked God to take this cup from him. Not his will, not God's will, but that Jesus wants not to have to suffer like this. Well, just as soon as he says those words, he realizes that it's not about Jesus, that it's about what God's will is. And he responds, not my will, but your will be done. And I read something not too long ago that said that the reason that Jesus asked the three men to go with him to watch, to stay awake and watch, was so that they would again know, learning how to handle a situation when they are in very, very, very dire straits. Because this was the worst strait in the world for Jesus. He knew he was walking to his death. But what he did is he went immediately to prayer. And when he asked God for his will to be done, he surrendered to God. And that's a lesson for all of us. When Jesus finished praying, he came back down, and old Judas shows up. Judas shows up with a whole detachment of soldiers and the temple guard for one man. Judas walks up to Jesus and kisses him on the cheek. So that's the signal for the soldiers to know that this is Jesus. And Jesus looks at him and says, I know why you're here. In different books of the Bible, he says different things, but basically he says, I know why you're here. Come on. Well, Peter, in trying to defend Jesus, gets up with his knife that he happened to have in his little sash probably, and he goes after them, and he cuts off the ear of, I think it's Malchus, one of the servants of the priest. And Jesus goes, no. I know what's going on here, Peter. No. This is what has to happen. So Jesus picks up Malchus's ear and puts it back on, heals him. I mean, it was obvious who Jesus was. And the thing that to me struck me so much in all of this is that Jesus knew what was going on because he was fully divine. And he was in control of every last step of this. So that's where we stopped today. Next week, we'll talk more about what happens after they arrest him, the crucifixion, and then the glorious news of the resurrection, which is the most wonderful news, what Jesus did for you and I. I hope you're all doing well. Remember that there are all those activities that are still sitting on the cart right under the portico at church. Please help yourself to that. And I pray that during this week, during this time, that you'll look outside and you'll see all the flowers that are blooming and all of the, just the trees that are budding out. And you'll think about that new birth, because this is what this whole story is about. The new birth, the resurrection, the new life that because of Jesus' sacrifice that you and I can have right now. Good night.